You ever wonder about the whole focus bracketing thing? You know, the settings and how easy is it to do? Wonder no more. It is awesome. It's a lot of fun. And the best thing about it is that you can do it anywhere you are, any place you are right now. Yeah, it doesn't get any better than this. Roll intro. Roll intro. Come on, let's get this thing working. Roll intro. Let's try this. Hi everyone and welcome to Pal to Tech. Today we're going to learn how to focus stack through the use of the focus bracketing feature on the Fujifilm X-T3, X-T2, and even X-T4. It's great for three reasons. First, for landscape photography. Let's say you can't or you don't want to stop down your lens. Focus stacking will give you that much needed flexibility for your images, and particularly for landscape. Number two, macro photography. It really shines for close-up macro images. You can achieve some very striking photos with amazing close-ups. And number three, it's just plain fun, right? I mean, different lenses will give you completely different experiences and allow you to get really creative using the focus bracketing technique. Now, before we get too far into it, there is a difference between focus stacking and focus bracketing. All right, for the purpose of this video, when I say focus bracketing, I mean that feature on the Fujifilm camera that will allow the camera to take a series of photos, each one with a different part in focus, which you can then manipulate later on in post-processing software such as Photoshop or Lightroom. Focus stacking refers to that technique, which you can use for any camera, in Photoshop or Lightroom or third-party software, which then takes a series of photos and will stack them together. So for the most part, they're kind of the same thing, but there is a slight difference between the two. So if you hear focus bracketing, it's more geared towards that feature on this camera that I'm going to show you how to set up. If you're hearing focus stacking, that is more the overall general technique of what I'm about to teach you. In today's tutorial, we are going to use an X-T3 camera, but the exact same settings that I'm going to teach you will apply to the X-T2 that has the most current firmware updates. Focus stacking begins with an understanding of depth of field. Depth of field is the distance between the closest and the furthest objects in a photo that are in focus. Many people assume that depth of field is solely determined by the aperture of the lens. You know, f11 has more depth of field than f4. The smaller the lens aperture, the more depth of field that you have. But depth of field is also determined by the focal length of the lens, as well as the distance between the camera and the subject. To shoot with focus bracketing, first off, you must have a sturdy tripod. It's the same principle as if you were shooting time-lapse photos. And by the way, if you want to learn more about time-lapse, I have an awesome video of it right here. Second, for the macro shot demo that we'll be doing right now, I'm going to be using a common Fujifilm prime lens, as well as the Fujifilm macro extension tube MCEX11. The first thing you're going to need to do to prepare your camera for focus stacking is to put this dial in bracketing mode. Don't forget to do that. It's an easy mistake to make, and if you keep it in S or continuous low or whatever, that is a real gotcha. Next, I recommend shooting RAW for sure. That'll give you the most options later on in post-production, so make sure you have your camera set to shoot RAW. Next, I recommend setting the shutter to electronic shutter. Another tip, when choosing a location to start your focus bracketing, if you've never really done it before, I recommend doing it indoors in kind of a macro setup, close up, so that you can have full control over the lighting while you're using this technique. It's really difficult if you're outside and you're not used to it and suddenly the light changes between shots. So I recommend do it indoors first, which I guess shouldn't be a problem now for most of us. Before you start shooting your focus stacking photos, take a picture of the front of your hand before you start the process. Then when you're finished, take one of the back of your hand. That way, when you bring it into Lightroom or Photoshop and you have that series of pictures, you will know where it begins and where it ends. Now, one major recommendation I have is to make sure your camera is in full manual mode. So basically you set your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO so that you have a very nice histogram value. If you don't know how to read a histogram yet, well, do the best you can and use the camera's light meters and LCD display to give you information as to your proper exposure. But if you do want to learn how to use a histogram, not bad. Let me know in the comments below and I'll do a video on that. Next, you want to disable automatic white balance. I would recommend setting a custom white balance using a professional color chart, or heck, you can even use a white piece of paper. You don't want to use a real wide open aperture such as f2.8. On the other hand, you certainly wouldn't want to use a small aperture such as f22 or f16 because you want to avoid any possibility of distortion or any, you want to find that sweet spot on the lens, right? And that's the aperture at which the lens has the best image quality all the way from the corners straight into the middle. And that can depend on what kind of lens you have. Each lens has its own sweet spot, best aperture for best image quality. And generally, as a general rule of thumb, your lens's sweet spot will be between 2 to 3 stops down from the lens's maximum aperture. So in the case of this lens right here, the 35mm f2.0, say 3 stops down from maximum aperture. If maximum aperture is f2, 1, 2, 3, like that, f5.6. Another thing that I recommend is that you check that your lens is able to focus on the furthest part of the shot that you want to appear sharp. This is especially important if you're using a macro lens or extension tubes. You also want to put your focus mode in manual. I recommend doing that. Yes, you can make it work with the focus point on S, but I've just found that if you kind of think of it as, I'm going to put the whole camera and everything in manual, it's just easier to remember. And now you need to set up your focus bracketing menu options. And they are set up differently depending upon what you are shooting, the type of lens you have, the distance you are to the subject, your creative vision, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, to go into the focus bracket settings of the camera, you go into the little camera icon and choose drive setting. From here, select bracket setting. Now, this is an area that can really trip people up because you have an area at the top and at the bottom. Do you see that right there? What you need to do is on the one on the top, you need to change bracket select. It'll probably be in exposure bracketing default. Change this to focus bracket. Do you see that? I cannot tell you the amount of times I would make all my other settings, I go out to shoot and it wouldn't work. And I guarantee you that is going to trip some of you up. Top menu, bracket select, choose focus bracket. Once you've done that, go down to focus bracket down here. And now we have our 3 options. The first is frames. Frames is the total number of images that you're taking, which can be set between 1 and 999. One thing to keep in mind is that the camera will stop shooting once it reaches infinity and gets all of the shots in focus that it needs. So you can't go wrong setting this to a higher number than you think you're going to need. As a good starting point, I set it to 50. Okay, now step. This setting, I think, is the single most undocumented and confusing setting on all of the Fujifilm camera system. Step is the setting you make to specify the distance that the camera moves the focus point forward as you take each shot. Each of the 1 to 10 step numbers corresponds to a certain value of distance. The lower the step number, the less the distance the focus point will be moved forward between each shot. So here's what's happening behind the scenes. As soon as you press the shutter and take your first picture, the camera runs a quick calculation of the distance between the near and the far limit of the depth of field of that very first image that you've just taken. So if you're shooting close-up macro, let's say, then that initial step value can be only a few millimeters. However, if you're shooting a landscape scene outside, that distance could be a few feet or meters. Are you with me so far? So when the camera shoots the very first photo in the bracketing series, the step distance reference value is initially assigned. Now, here's how the step numbers 1 through 10 come into play. If you set the step number to 1, this will move the focus point forward by 20% of the total calculated distance between each shot. Step 2 will move it forward 40%, and each step will increment it by 20% until it reaches step 5. At step 5, you are now telling the camera to use 100% of that initial reference value of the distance that was calculated on that first shot you took. So between each shot, again, the camera will move the focus point forward, exactly matching that initial calculated distance value based on the step number preference that you've made here. Now, in all my research, I couldn't find anywhere official that explained what happens if you use steps 6 through 10. However, logically, one would think that step 6 would move the focus point forward 120% of the initial calculated distance. Step 7 would move it forward 140% until you reach step 10, at which point you would be moving the focus point forward at double the initial calculated value. Think of these numbers as like a volume knob. The higher the number, the higher the step number, the greater the distance the camera will move that area of focus as it takes each shot. Frankly, if you're feeling a little lost with all of this technical explanation, let me help you out. Just set it to step 10. I think that will work out well for you in a variety of shooting situations. So I could have just said that off the beginning, but I wanted to tell you what's going on here. Next is the interval. And the interval is simply the time in seconds that the camera will pause between each shot in the focus bracketing series, okay? Now, if you're shooting with an electronic shutter, you can go ahead and set this to 0. You don't need the camera to wait at all. But if you're using a mechanical shutter, then, or let's say you're on a tripod that you don't think is quite stable, for whatever reason, you could bump this up to 1 second. I have never set it to anything other than 0, and it's worked just fine. Okay, for the subject of my focus bracketing tutorial today will be this ABC pin right here. Came from the 1984 Olympics. We're gonna be shooting this with the Fujifilm 35mm prime f2.0 using the macro extension tube that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is set my custom white balance. I'm gonna get my lighting set up. I've got this little kind of small aperture light just to throw a bit extra light onto it right here. And in the camera menu settings, I'm gonna go ahead and drop my ISO down to 160, the lowest, until I can kind of balance it out. Right about here, I think is okay. Not too bad there, but I do need to set my custom white balance so that it's consistent. For that, I'm just gonna use a white piece of paper right here, simple, and I'm gonna put it as close as I can to the subject right here. I go into my menu settings, into the image quality area, and down to where it says white balance, custom. I'm gonna go ahead and press OK. And it says to put a piece of paper within that square, that white square there, and then to go ahead and press the shutter release to take a picture, which will then set the custom white balance. I'm gonna do that right now. Boom, you see that? You see how it changed? Look at that. Then I'm gonna say okay to set it. I now have oh, that looks better. That looks better already. White piece of paper is all you need, folks, and that's gonna stay consistent between every single shot of the focus bracketing. To kind of prepare this for manual focusing, I went into my menu and I set manual focus assist to peak red highlight. You see that? Red highlight. So now when I turn, I've got it in manual focus. When I turn the focus ring, you can kind of see the red, which is the area that happens to be in focus. You see that? So what I'm gonna do is just check that I can get the entire area, this pin, the entire subject in focus. So I'm turning the ring, I'm going through it, turning, and there, you see the back right there? I might want to actually move it up just a little bit there. Okay, now I go back, and what you want to do first is focus on the area closest to you. So in this case, it's going to be right here. Another thing you could do to just check your focus even more is press the back command dial like that, and it zooms in, and you can do this. See that? Okay, I think that's pretty good. Next, we're going to go into our focus bracketing settings, as I mentioned earlier, and just confirm that we have 50 frames, 10 step, 0 interval. And finally, I am going to go into my self timer and just set it for 2 seconds, just to avoid the shake of pressing down the shutter release button. So we are ready to go. And nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? I warned you. I warned you in the beginning of this video. You need to put the dial, the Fujifilm dial, in bracketing mode. I always forget that. No, this is not a bit for this video. I literally just forgot to do this, okay? And I'm teaching you this, so people forget. At least I forget. Let's try it again. Okay, here we go. And I'm pressing the shutter release. Now, it doesn't seem like much has happened, but the camera has actually taken 50 shots of this pin, each one stepped forward with various focus points. Got it? Okay, now that we have them, let's go into Lightroom, Photoshop, and a couple of other great programs, and let me show you how to focus stack. The first thing I like to do once I have my photos in Lightroom is sort them by capture time. That way it's absolutely guaranteed for me that they're gonna be in the order of that focus stacking point moving forward. Now, you have kind of 2 ways of doing this. You could edit and make all of your adjustments and fine tuning to the first photo, say in the series, and then copy all of those adjustments to all the other photos. Or you could do nothing at all and just start focus stacking, and then when you're finished focus stacking, you'll have that one finished photo, and that could be the photo you work on and make your final adjustments. Okay, so to start the photo stacking process, we are going to send these images from Lightroom into Photoshop. Here's how you do that. Select the first photo, go all the way to the end, select the last photo, then select Photo, Edit In, Open as Layers in Photoshop. What that's going to do is open up Photoshop, take each photo that you've selected and make it its own separate layer. Now keep in mind that if you're using raw files from your Fujifilm, particularly uncompressed raw files, it's going to be a huge Photoshop file if you go to save it. You might want to consider working only in JPEG, but then of course you're going to lose your versatility and ability to make significant adjustments to the photo. So what I tend to do is I always shoot in RAW, I bring them into Photoshop in RAW, I process them in Photoshop, and then I will merge all the layers into one layer and then just save it that way as one TIFF file, which I can then go back into Lightroom and make my adjustments on. Once they arrive in Photoshop, you will see each of the raw files as its own separate layer. What you want to do is select all of the layers. So start with the first one, go down to the bottom, hold down Shift so that you've selected all the layers. Then you want to go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. Make sure that Auto is ticked right there. You do not need to do anything else, and click OK. What Photoshop is now doing is aligning each layer. You're going to need to do this to get ready for the next step you're going to take. This can take a while, so, go grab a cup of coffee or something and then come back. Okay, so now that that's done, you need to do another step. You need to actually merge them into one layer. So what you're going to do is make sure that all of them are selected again. Go to Edit, Auto Blend Layers. Make sure that Stack Images is selected right here and tick the box that says Seamless Tones and Colors. Go ahead and tick OK. What Photoshop is actually doing right now is it's creating layer masks based on what areas of the photos are in focus or not. Once that's finished, you can now see you have layer masks for each of the areas that are in focus. This is very, very cool. Have a look at this. This is the final result. Now, if you want to save this and go back into Lightroom, there's something you should know. Because you have all of these layers and each one is basically a raw file, if you try and save this as a regular TIFF or Photoshop with all of the layers, forget it. You won't be able to. It'll be too big. So what I do is I go up to File, Save As, and I'll rename this to something like, Final Merged Photoshop. Make sure you untick layers. That's what I do. I untick layers, so it's just going to save it as one merged together file. I click Save. Now, if I bring it back into Lightroom, there it is right here at the end, and I can then go into my Develop module and make whatever adjustments that I want to. Keep in mind that if you do that and you're working on the adjustments after the fact, you're not going to be able to get those Fujifilm film simulations as you would in the beginning of the process if you copy them across, if that makes sense. Photoshop is not the only game in town to do focus stacking. There are third-party software programs that are built specifically to help you do focus stacking. Helicon Focus and Serene Stacker. What I really like about Helicon Focus is that it integrates into Lightroom. So what you can do is instead of going over to Photoshop and doing all that, you can select all the photos in Lightroom and then export them right into Helicon Focus. Let me show you how you do that. Okay, so I'm selected all my photos, and all I'm doing right now is going into my export, and there it is right there, Helicon Focus. You see that? And that's it. It's going to now bring it into that third-party program. I am literally going to do the settings that come up right here, radius on 2, smoothing on 2. And these actually give you way more control, at least easier control, than you would get in Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and hit render. It basically converts your Fujifilm RAW files into TIFF before it brings it into Helicon Focus. Have a look at this. Look at this. All finished. And there it is. It brought it right back in. And if I go into the Develop module, I can see it. This came from the third-party program, round-tripped back into Lightroom. Finally, let's look at a third app, Serene Stacker. Now, this one will not work with native Fujifilm RAW files. So you either have to convert them into TIFF, or you could just throw the JPEGs in here. I'm just going to throw the JPEGs in here just to show you. Dragging them over and dropping them into the program right here. Let's see how it looks with the JPEGs. Okay, once it's done, I'm going to go ahead and save output image as a TIFF 16-bit. And here it is. The photo on the left is done by Serene Stacker. The photo on the right is done by Photoshop. But one thing that I noticed is that Photoshop didn't handle some of the areas that were out of focus. So have a look at this. If you zoom in and you look over here, you see this area right here? Not so good. That was Photoshop, okay? I'm sure you could dig down into Photoshop and you could manually edit all of the layer masks, but for a minimum of hassle and a minimum of fuss, if you just quickly process those into a focus stack, Serene Stacker does a better job than Photoshop, according to how I'm testing it here. I started this video and doing the research and doing the demos of focus stacking, I started it way back last year in November. I've literally been working on this video longer than this pandemic has been on the earth. And I have to tell you, I'm glad I stuck with it, and I'm glad I finally have been able to show it to you, because I think more than ever, now is the time to try this out. It is a lot of fun. I will have links to resources down below that can help you. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, and if you found it helpful, please give it the like and subscribe. And of course, I will see you in another video real soon. Take care. This is the stuff you don't see, because a lot of YouTubers will cut it out, right? Okay, I'm importing the photos into the Lightroom now, boom, and then they're imported. But actually behind the scenes, we just sit here with nothing to do, but maybe have some water. Still waiting. I should do a Patreon account where all I do, everybody pays $1 a month, and they get to watch what happens while I'm waiting for photos to import into Lightroom. I wonder if I could like make a few bucks off that. I better do something. This channel is not making a lot of money right now. All right, let's get back to it.